Hi everyone, I am Rishi Panchal and welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into one of the most critical yet underappreciated aspects of semiconductor manufacturing, photoresists. But this isn't just any story about photoresists. This is about a potential revolution that's been quietly brewing in the semiconductor industry for the past decade. For nearly 40 years, one type of photoresist has dominated the industry, chemically amplified resists, or CARs. But the introduction of extreme ultraviolet lithography, EUV, has opened the door to perhaps revolutionary new photoresist technologies. And today, we're going to explore two fascinating new players that could reshape the entire industry: metal oxide resists and dry resist processing. Before we dive into the revolutionary stuff, let's make sure we're all on the same page about what photoresists actually are and why they're so critical to chip manufacturing. Photoresist is absolutely essential to the photolithography process. It's how we apply intricate chip designs to silicon wafers using high-powered UV light. Think of it like a super sophisticated version of film photography, but instead of capturing images, we're creating the microscopic patterns that become transistors. Here's how the process works. First, we apply a layer of liquid photoresist onto the wafer using a method called spin coating. Imagine putting honey on a spinning record. That's essentially what's happening, except with incredibly precise chemicals and at thousands of RPMs. After drying that resist layer, the chip design gets projected onto the wafer using an UV exposure tool. This is where the magic happens. The UV light chemically modifies the resist in specific patterns. After exposure, we do what's called a post-exposure bake, kind of like developing film in a dark room, and then we develop the latent image to remove the exposed parts, assuming we're using what's called a positive photoresist. During the subsequent etch step, we use either acid or plasma-based methods to permanently engrave the design into the silicon underneath. After etching is complete, we strip off the remaining resist and voila, we've created the foundation of a microchip. Now, these photoresists are extremely delicate formulations. We're talking about materials that are often custom mixed for specific customer requirements, and they have to be absolutely pure. Any contamination can be financially devastating. Just to give you an idea of the stakes here, TSMC once suffered an issue with impure resist polymer ingredients that killed an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 wafers and cost the company $500 million. $500 million from a photoresist contamination issue. So, what exactly are these chemically amplified resists that have dominated the industry for 4 decades? CARs are special chemical compounds with several key components, and their operation is actually quite elegant. When UV light hits the resist layer, it activates one of the CAR's components called a photoacid generator, or PAG for short. The name really says it all. The photoacid generator generates acid. But here's where it gets interesting. This acid goes on to catalyze another reaction within the CAR. It removes a chemical component known as a dissolution inhibitor that previously blocked the CAR's ability to dissolve in developer liquid. Think of the dissolution inhibitor like a lock, and the acid like a key that unlocks multiple doors. The really clever part is that this reaction doesn't consume the acid. That little bit of acid remains free to catalyze more reactions around the area where the original photon hit. A single photoacid generator molecule can catalyze hundreds of reactions. This is the amplification in chemically amplified resists. One photon creates one bit of acid, but that acid can trigger hundreds of chemical changes. CARs were pioneered in the early 1980s by researchers at IBM as a complement to KrF 248 nanometer lithography. After more than 30 years in the industry, semiconductor fabs have become incredibly familiar with CARs. Their processes, fab layouts, and equipment are all specifically designed around handling these materials. Today, the car industry is dominated by Japanese companies. Tokyo Oka, JSR, and Shin-Etsu are the big three, with the first two being the largest suppliers, each commanding about 30% of the global market share. These companies have spent decades perfecting their car formulations and building relationships with major semiconductor manufacturers. Now, when engineers evaluate the performance of photoresists, particularly cars, they use what's known as the RLS Tradeoff. This is absolutely fundamental to understanding why new resist technologies are needed. RLS stands for resolution, line edge, width, roughness, and sensitivity. Let me break down each of these. Resolution actually has two components. First is pitch resolution. the smallest pitch that the lithography tool can print. Pitch is the distance between two neighboring features, and it determines how tightly we can pack transistors together. This depends on the famous Rayleigh criteria, which involves wavelength and numerical aperture. The second component is feature resolution, the smallest individual feature size that the tool can print. This determines transistor performance and depends on both the lithography tool and the resist properties. Line edge roughness measures how much an individual edge deviates from the ideal straight line. Line width roughness looks at the total variation in distance from one edge to the other. Essentially, these metrics measure whether the resist can maintain smooth, clean lines and edges without irregular waviness. This has become increasingly critical as device features have shrunk below the 100 nanometer mark. Finally, sensitivity measures the dose of light needed to change the resist's behavior. In other words, how responsive is the resist to the lithography tool's light exposure? Low sensitivity is problematic because it means either increasing the exposure dose, which is expensive because it reduces throughput, or making the resist layer thicker, which increases the risk of pattern collapse. Here's the kicker. With cars, these three parameters are coupled. Improving one typically worsens one or both of the others. This is the infamous RLS trade-off that has plagued resist engineers for decades. For example, if you want to improve a car's sensitivity to light, you might intuitively add more photoacid generators to create more acid catalysts. But there's a problem. The acid catalyst's movement can't be precisely controlled. It's stochastic, meaning it's essentially random. The acid can spread beyond where you want it to go, creating unwanted rough edges and hurting line edge roughness. The acid diffusion also blurs the printed image, like writing with too much ink on paper. This creates blur that hurts resolution. There's actually a mathematical relationship for this. The product of resolution cubed, line edge roughness squared, and dose to size is constant. Try to improve one parameter, and the others get worse in response. Cars worked beautifully for deep UV lithography, but when EUV was introduced, we ran into some fundamental physics problems. The issue is that resist materials absorb DUV and EUV photons in fundamentally different ways. DUV light is absorbed at a molecular level, which allows resist makers to tune their formulations by adding or removing specific molecular groups. It's like adjusting the recipe for a cake. You can add more sugar here, less flour there. EUV photons, however, interact with matter at an atomic level. This makes absorption a function of elemental composition, specifically the atomic number or Z number of the elements in the resist. Traditional cars are made primarily from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These elements have relatively low Z numbers, meaning they're not particularly good at stopping or absorbing EUV photons. It's like trying to stop a cannonball with a piece of paper instead of a steel plate. When the first generation of EUV entered high-volume manufacturing in 2017-2018 at the 7 nanometer process node, fabs initially used existing 193 nanometer cars with only light modifications. This wasn't because these resists were ideal for EUV. It was because fabs were already familiar with cars, and there were established ways to improve sensitivity without completely redesigning their processes. However, this approach brought new challenges. With fewer EUV photons reaching the wafer surface, since each EUV photon requires much more energy to produce than DUV photons, we started seeing worse issues with what's called photon shot noise. Let me put this in perspective. At about 30 millijoules per square centimeter, each 10 square nanometer area receives approximately 2,024 photons. But there's about 2.2% random variation in this distribution. A car that's too sensitive will interpret these random variations as actual signals, worsening line edge roughness and resolution. The industry's initial response was simply to increase EUV exposure doses rather than trying to make the resist more sensitive. But subsequent generations of cars introduced various innovations to improve EUV sensitivity without completely sacrificing the other performance parameters. There's been tremendous work on controlling acid diffusion, essentially managing how the catalyst acid travels from the point where the EUV photon hits. JSR, one of the major resist suppliers, has discussed several strategies including adding special compounds called quenchers that restrain acid catalysts, as well as completely new types of photoacid generators. One particularly interesting development is fluorinated PAGs, which are said to be more sensitive to EUV wavelengths. Another approach involves adding metal-based sensitizers to boost existing PAGs. When EUV photons hit the resist, they ionize it and release free electrons. Sensitizers capture these electrons and convert them into additional acid, amplifying the effect of the original PAGs. Perhaps the most sophisticated development is the photosensitized chemically amplified resist, or PSCAR, developed jointly by Tokyo Electron and JSR. This is like a regular car, but includes an additional component called a photosensitizer precursor. Let's call it PP for short. The process also includes an extra post-exposure step. Here's how it works. When EUV light hits the PSCAR and creates the initial acid catalyst, that acid converts the PP into an active photosensitizer. Then, after EUV exposure, the entire wafer gets flooded with 365 nanometer UV light. This UV light causes the photosensitizer to activate additional PAGs, creating more acid precisely at the locations where EUV photons originally hit. It's like having a secondary amplification system on top of the primary one. Right now, these modified EUV cars are working reasonably well for what we call low NA EUV lithography. But there's growing concern that cars will finally hit their fundamental limits, especially with the introduction of ASML's next generation lithography machines, high NA EUV systems. Higher numerical aperture allows you to project patterns with even better resolution, which should translate to smaller features. That sounds great, but as always in semiconductor manufacturing, you don't get something for nothing. Raising the NA means making the mirrors bigger and heavier, but more critically, it results in a much thinner depth of focus. Depth of focus is the vertical distance range where image quality remains acceptable. Essentially, how much tolerance you have in the vertical direction before your patterns start getting blurry. The relationship is brutal. Depth of focus is inversely proportional to the square of the numerical aperture. So if you double the NA, your depth of focus becomes 1/4 as deep. This quadratic relationship means that high NA EUV will have dramatically shallower depth of focus than current systems. This creates a significant problem, because when we image the wafer, we're imaging through the entire resist layer. If that layer is thicker than the machine's depth of focus, you'll have features that print perfectly at one depth but are completely out of focus at another depth. The solution seems obvious. Use thinner resist layers. But remember, cars already have relatively weak sensitivity to EUV light. Making the layers even thinner raises serious questions about whether they can properly resolve images and whether they can provide sufficient etch resistance during the subsequent processing steps. There are potential workarounds. Fabs might deposit thin nitride or metal hard masks between the silicon substrate and the resist layer. You would do a preliminary etch into the hard mask, strip off the photoresist, and then do the main etch into the silicon using the hard mask as a template. This adds process complexity and cost, but it's the kind of innovation the semiconductor industry excels at. But there's an even more fundamental concern with high NA EUV. While low NA EUV systems didn't always push to their absolute resolution limits, they could typically handle down to about 28 nanometer pitch. High NA EUV is expected to routinely operate below 20 nanometer pitch. At these dimensions, we start encountering serious molecular and mechanical limitations with cars that directly impact resolution and line edge roughness. The molecular issue is straightforward. Cars are simply big. They're polymer-based, consisting of long chains of molecules repeating over and over. This makes them quite bulky, typically about 3 to 5 nanometers in size. When you're trying to pattern features smaller than 20 nanometers, having 5 nanometer molecular building blocks creates inherent roughness and resolution limitations. It's like trying to draw fine details with a thick marker. The mechanical concerns center around something called pattern collapse, which is exactly what it sounds like. After exiting the exposure tool, the patterned resist layer is quite delicate. It still needs to be baked and developed before going to the etch step, and development typically involves rinsing the wafer with liquid developer. After development, there's a cleaning rinse, followed by drying. But liquid often remains trapped between the narrow pattern lines. The surface tension of this liquid, combined with other mechanical stresses, creates capillary forces that can literally deform the delicate pattern lines or even make them topple over like dominoes. There are mitigation strategies, adding surfactants to the rinsing liquids or using supercritical carbon dioxide for drying. But these introduce their own risks, including swelling or shrinking of the features. Another related concern is substrate delamination. where the entire resist layer peels off the wafer like old paint. This is usually due to poor adhesion between the resist and wafer surface, but can also be caused by mechanical stress from those liquid surface tension forces. While none of these issues are necessarily deal breakers individually, together they've created a compelling case for exploring entirely new resist platforms. And the most promising of these new approaches are metal oxide resists. Metal oxide resists represent a fundamentally different approach to EUV lithography. Unlike cars, these resists change directly when hit by an EUV photon. There are no complicated multi-component compounds and no chemical amplification effects. At their core, these are metal oxides, typically zinc or tin oxide, attached to organic molecules. The key advantage is that metals have much higher Z numbers than the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that make up traditional cars. This makes metal oxide resists 4 to 5 times more sensitive to EUV photons than organic cars. But the benefits go beyond just sensitivity. These are also far simpler chemicals. Unlike cars, they're molecular rather than polymeric. Being smaller, typically individual molecules rather than long chains, implies significant improvements in resolution and line roughness. Moreover, because they don't rely on the unpredictable diffusion behavior of acid catalysts, they should provide better performance in terms of blur and line edge roughness. The stochastic acid diffusion that plagues cars simply isn't a factor with metal oxide resists. There's another practical benefit. After development, the metal oxide resist shell is reportedly robust enough that fabs can skip depositing the hard mask layer I mentioned earlier. This could simplify the overall process flow. The concept of metal-based resists for EUV has been around for a while, but there's currently some legal drama around who actually deserves credit for the key innovations and patents. There are two main players in this story. First is Dr. Robert Brainard, a professor at the University at Albany, State University of New York. He's a longtime photoresist authority who did pioneering work on metal-based EUV resists as part of a program called Molecular Organometallic Resist for EUV, or MORE. The second major player is Inpria Corporation, which spun out of Oregon State University's Department of Chemistry in 2007, based on work by Professor Doug Kessler. They've been promoting adoption of their tin metal oxide resists for almost a decade now. As Inpria proved out their approach, they attracted support from semiconductor industry giants. The investor list reads like a who's who of the chip industry. In 2014, they raised $7.3 million in Series A funding led by Samsung Ventures with participation from Intel and Applied Materials venture arms. 3 years later, they closed a $23 million Series B round, again led by Samsung Ventures with participation from existing investors Intel and Applied Materials. Notably, Japanese photoresist giant JSR joined this round, their first investment in Inpria. In 2020, Inpria raised $31 million in Series C funding, this time with JSR as the lead investor. The round included existing investors Samsung, Applied Materials, and Intel, plus new additions SK Hynix and TSMC. It really was like assembling the semiconductor Avengers. The story reached its climax in 2021 when JSR, after buying 21% of the company in previous rounds, agreed to acquire the rest of Inpria for over $500 million. Today, Inpria operates as a wholly owned JSR subsidiary with research and manufacturing facilities in Corvallis, Oregon. But Inpria isn't the only company working on next-generation resist technologies. Lam Research has developed their own metal oxide resist called Ether, and they're taking a radically different approach to the entire process. Like Inpria's offering, Ether is a metal oxide resist that Lam believes will be game-changing for the industry. But Ether's major differentiator is that it's dry. It's not applied as a liquid using traditional spin coating methods. Instead, Lam Research uses something similar to atomic layer deposition, or ALD. In this process, chemical precursors are combined in alternating pulse and purge steps to slowly build up a chemical layer on the substrate. It's like painting with individual molecular layers instead of brushing on liquid paint. But the really innovative part of Lam's approach is dry development. Instead of using liquid developers that can cause pattern collapse, they use plasma or gas phase chemistry to remove unexposed resist regions after exposure. It's similar to dry etching processes that are already widely used in semiconductor manufacturing. By eliminating liquid from the development process, you remove what's often considered the single largest risk factor for pattern collapse in extremely small features. This could potentially reduce defects and save costs for both memory and logic fabs. However, dry development isn't a panacea. It has its own challenges, particularly around selectivity. The dry development gas must strongly differentiate between EUV exposed and unexposed regions. If selectivity is too low, you're forced to use higher EUV doses, and you risk something called corner rounding, where sharp pattern corners get eaten away to form undesirable rounded shapes. Lam Research has developed additional process steps to address some of these issues, including ion beam post-exposure treatments designed to smooth resist patterns and reduce required EUV doses. It reminds me of the secondary UV flood exposure in JSR's PSCAR technology. There seems to be a trend toward multi-step, more complex processing to optimize resist performance. Given the similarities between what Inpria and Lam Research are doing, it's perhaps not surprising that legal battles have emerged. In October 2022, Inpria filed a patent infringement lawsuit against Lam Research, claiming that Lam's dry resist products violate 3 of their patents. They're seeking a jury trial to resolve the dispute. But the situation became even more complicated in January 2024 when the State University of New York filed their own lawsuit against both Inpria and JSR. SUNY claimed that their professor, Dr. Robert Brainard, originally invented the metal oxide resist concept back in 2011, and that Inpria wrongly incorporated and patented that prior work during a 2014 collaboration. SUNY sought a restraining order to prevent Inpria from using or transferring the contested patents, but the court denied that request. Lam Research has asked the court to pause the Inpria lawsuit while the ownership questions are resolved. Both lawsuits remain active as of this recording. Despite the legal uncertainties, both companies are pushing forward with commercialization efforts. But adoption won't be trivial. If fabs want to fully capitalize on metal oxide resist's benefits, they'll need to do significant retooling, particularly of the coder and developer systems that apply and process the resist. Given that major chip makers have 50 to 60 EUV machines in their fabs, this represents a substantial investment. There are also legitimate concerns about metal contamination. Metals can be problematic in semiconductor fabs because they can create surface defects on silicon wafers, degrade transistor performance, or diffuse into the silicon and affect electrical properties. So where does this leave us? The costs of adopting metal oxide resists are substantial, but both Inpria and Lam Research are betting that their products can deliver enough value through reduced defects, lower EUV exposure costs, and simplified processing flows to justify those investments. Meanwhile, the car industry isn't going quietly into the night. After nearly 40 years of dominance, these companies are doing intense work to extend cars' viability even in the high-NA EUV era. What we're witnessing is a fascinating technology transition that could reshape the entire photoresist industry. Whether metal oxide resists become the new standard, or whether cars find new ways to adapt and survive, will likely be determined over the next few years as high-NA EUV systems begin entering production. It's a reminder that even in mature industries like semiconductor manufacturing, revolutionary changes are always possible when fundamental physics pushes existing technologies to their limits. Thank you for watching this video till end. Drop your comments below and follow me more such content.